To begin with the next session, Dr. Pandav is the chief instructor for the next session. Before we start the course, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker, our international keynote speaker, Dr. Saurabh Goel. So I would request the backend team. Yeah, welcome Saurabh. Saurabh is seen. Uh, so I request the backend team to display the CE slide. Yeah. So I hope it's audible and visible. So Dr. Saurabh Goel basically hails from Indore. So that is his background. He hails from Indore and he did his MBBS from Indore and his post graduation from Surat. He's done his FRCS, MRCO, FRCO. He's right now he's a consultant in St. Thomas Hospital in London and an honorary lecturer at King's College London. He has special interest including newer treatments and outcomes for laser and laser surgery for glaucoma. He was a part of the principal investigator for the Eagle for quite a few studies, to name a few: the Eagle study, the PTVT study, TAC study, and the concept. He was the first to publish on the outflow of aqueous-related SLT laser treatment and is currently studying minimally invasive glaucoma surgery devices for the same. So he passionately believes that the vast majority of glaucoma blindness can be prevented by early diagnosis and effective management. And Dr. Saurabh, that's what we all glaucoma specialists believe in. So without wasting much of time, I invite you. So backend team, I request to play the pre-recorded talk what Dr. Saurabh has sent to us. Welcome, Saurabh. Welcome to this great scientific fiesta.
Morning, everyone. Greetings from London. And thank you, Amit and Partha, for the kind invite. I've been asked to talk about bleb dysesthesia. As we all know, trabeculectomy surgery still remains the gold standard for glaucoma surgery. However, there are some inherent problems still associated, which are listed here with some of the solutions. And today we are talking about bleb dysesthesia. And in summary, the solution is a wider diffuse bleb, which is fully covered with the lid. So this is our aspiration, that we have a diffuse bleb, which is large but low in height, and it's not overriding the cornea, and with a good pressure of 10. It's covered by the lids so that we can't even see and the patient doesn't feel it. However, it doesn't always end up like that. We can have a big bleb, we can have an overhanging bleb, we can have bleb in the wrong position, and this is, however, still our ideal, which we should be aiming for, which is a diffuse bleb underneath the lid. And here you can see the difference between old style surgery, where there has been a large dose of mitomycin application here, but it's ended up with a focal bleb because it's not being diffusely applied, and the bleb is nasal and the patient is uncomfortable, and she's on drops and has irritation. Whereas when she came under my care, the other eye was done with the newer technique with larger area of application, and she's got a much comfortable and diffuse bleb. If you look at the PTVT trial, it's not uncommon. Bleb dysesthesia was about 3%, which is similar to diplopia or shallow flat anterior chamber. So you can see that bleb dysesthesia is actually can happen even in the hands of the best of the surgeons. And I personally feel it's probably more common than this, because most patients feel that if the pressure is fine, they're okay and they don't complain about it. But when you ask for it, it's probably more than this. So what are the symptoms? So we have foreign body sensation, watering, discomfort, even the lid retracts, and you have an unhappy patient. There was an RCT on the bleb position from Dundee in Scotland, and way back nearly 20 years ago now, and it showed that the nasal blebs have a much more uncomfortable, and probably in 45% of cases they had bleb dysesthesia. This is from Bascom Palmer, and Don Biddens showed that the factors associated were younger age, a supranasal bleb, a poor lid coverage, and bubble formation. Bubble formation is when you blink, there's a formation of bubble, and you'll see an example later. So blebs can be very subjective. What may be good for you may not be good for the patient, and the vice versa. So like this large bleb, may be, you might think it's not very good, but actually the patient is comfortable and there is no problem. What we want to do is avoid uncomfortable bleb, because our understanding, our teaching is do no harm, because patient doesn't feel the pressure, the patient feels the bleb. So when there is uncomfortable bleb, and the patient will be the best person to tell you, that's the time when we need to do something, and we need to prevent it. This is one of my patients who has ended up with a slightly nasal extension of the bleb, but she's quite happy to just use lubrication drops and managing with that alone. There's another patient who came under my care a few years ago. As you can see, she has a large area of MMC application, but ended up with a ring of steel. That leads to intra-bleb pressure, and then sometimes the blebs can start leaking. She's had 2 revisions already, and she doesn't want any more revisions. She's aware about the risk of infection. As you can see, the bleb leaks. And then when she came again another year, and then the bleb leak had stopped. So this can be an intermittent leak, and the patient doesn't want any intervention. So then there is no indication for surgery, and she understands the risk of infection and sight loss. This is one of my patients, which I showed earlier, who came with very high pressures, but now has good pressures. But part of the bleb is extending nasally, and that's causing her discomfort, as we just saw earlier. So this is the area of concern. And as you will see, and be careful at the beginning, you will see the bubble formation right at the beginning. So there we go. So as the patient blinks, bubble forms, and you will see that there is area of non-wetting in this area where the cornea doesn't get the tear film where the bleb is, and that causes the discomfort. So why do the blebs end up nasally? We saw that sometimes, it can be done. Is it something which we are doing deliberately to keep space for further surgery? Or do they achieve better pressure as shown in Dundee, but that was non-significant as compared to superior pressures? Or is it something else? So the answer is that the eye rotates from upright to supine position. So when the person is upright and when they lie down, the eye exocyclotortates more. So the nasal position becomes superior position in most patients. And this can be up to 15 to 20 degrees with an average of 3 to 5 degrees. And it will be there with local anesthetic. It will be there with peribulbars and even in GA because the person lies down. So what is the solution? The solution is to assess the lid position and mark the area of maximum lid coverage pre-op on the slit lamp so that we know where the 12 o'clock is. This video, part of this was made by my fellow a few years ago who won a prize for this. So that's, as we see in the eye cyclotorts, most commonly as compared to incyclotorsion. And before the surgery, I always mark the 12 o'clock. So you assess them on slit lamp, see where the lid is covering, see where the 12 o'clock is, and then with a hypodermic needle, mark the area so that you can stain that during the surgery. And as you can see in this patient, it's already rotated by 15 to 20 degrees where the 12 o'clock you thought would be if you were operating. Have a large area of mitomycin so you achieve a very diffuse bleb, and and it's not very high. And when you close the conch, you do a edge-to-edge closure so that the conch doesn't hang over. So if you think about this, so if the bleb dysesthesia still occurs, what can you do? You can apply lubrication drops, topical NSAIDs, steroids, bandage contact lens. And if you do get dysesthesia and you have to revise, then what is our aim? We need to remove the bleb outside the lid margin. For that, we need to do partial bleb excision, reduce the height of the bleb, for which we do compression sutures, redirect the flow posteriorly by doing needling, and allow healing, especially if there is a low pressure, by doing cautery, providing a conjunctival barrier, or autologous blood injection. Like this patient had surgery and then came under my care, but she's not troubled by it. But you can see that she needed a larger area of mitomycin C, and that would give you a diffuse bleb. So this patient was referred to me, and he came to me saying, look, I cannot live with this, and he has tried for several months. And you can see that, again, nasal bleb coming underneath the lid and causing discomfort. So this is the revision. So again, you mark the area pre-op. So again, you can see that even for revision, when I have marked, the 12 o'clock has rotated. So otherwise, and this could be the reason why during the surgery, this ended up being nasal. So I'm doing some posterior needling now to redirect the flow. And we have now opening up the conch and removing the excess bleb, which is just like a sponge tissue, subtenous tissue, which you have to take out as much as, so I'm even pulling it out from the lower part and then excising the ones which we do not want underneath the outside the lid margin, opening up the conch at the limbus and then cauterizing the area where we want the scarring and adhesion, undermining the conch and refashioning the conch and repositioning it so that it doesn't remain under, it doesn't come outside the lid, and then closing the conch. and you do a conjunctival barrier on the other side, there won't be any leak as it's a diffuse bleb. And after the surgery, the patient just 6 weeks later is much more comfortable and he's happy with that. So a bleb is a diffuse bleb, is like a sponge. It's not like a focal area which will just leak unless you have a scleral thinning, which will then leak when you open this up. These are more referral cases. And as you can see, the bleb is extending and I'm providing a barrier. So by putting Palmberg compression sutures, which are 10O nylon or 9O nylon or 9O or 10O Prolene, so which are reducing the height of the bleb. So you do these in all the areas where the bleb is extending. And there's another case, similar situation. So again, a Palmberg compression sutures. And then once you've done that, I'm doing some posterior needling to redirect the flow, and then injecting autologous blood to try, which acts as a glue. So wherever you don't want the bleb to be, the glue will cause the healing. So another case I did about a couple of months ago, she had surgery in Nigeria where both eyes had similar blebs like this, and now this one is revised and is covering the lid. So what is the problem? The problem is that the bleb dysesthesia is not uncommon, causes high nasal, and think about globe rotation, focal blebs which are not covered with the eyelid. And the prevention is to mark the 12 o'clock, have a large area of MMC, and a conjunctival edge-to-edge closure. If it does occur, you can manage conservatively by doing nothing and reassuring the patient, teardrops, steroid, non-steroidal drops. And if you have to excise, then partial or complete excision, compression sutures, posterior needling, cautery, and autologous blood injection, as we have seen. So in the end, as we know, happy patients make happy doctors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Saurav. That was an excellent presentation. Request you to stay for this session. We'll start with the session of Dr. Pandav, and we'll take questions at the end of this session because we are running short of time. So over to you, Dr. Pandav.
Thank you, Dr. Amit, and thank you, Dr. Saurav, for that excellent presentation. I think that's really great. We all come across with these kind of situations, and we have to deal with them often. But because of shortage of time, I think we'll go straight to our program. This program is basically on glaucoma drainage devices. So now we are shifting the blebs from in the perilumbal area to behind, more posteriorly to the subtenon space. And hopefully we don't see that kind of a situation, but still we get blebs and which are not that good. In this session, we are basically talking about the glaucoma drainage devices and the various aspects. So this we assume that the viewers have a little basic knowledge of the glaucoma drainage devices, and we are building this program on that basic knowledge. So I'll straight away go to the first speaker for this session, and we'll start with the the indications and general considerations for glaucoma implant surgery. And the speaker is Dr. Purvi Bhagat. Dr. Purvi is a well-known glaucoma surgeon in Ahmedabad. She teaches in the medical college in Ahmedabad, she's a associate professor there. Dr. Purvi, can you please load your?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, all, and thank you, Dr. Pandav, sir, for including in this IC. We all know that trabeculectomy is the gold standard surgery for all patients, and GDDs, that is the glaucoma drainage implants, are now almost considered a silver standard surgery because they are the second most common performed surgery. But in spite of that, we have still a lot of concerns regarding its indications and which design to use and how does it work and all that. So I'll be talking on those indications and some general considerations. The presentation is for academic interest only and no financial interest associated with any names that I mentioned. So how did the GDD first of all start? Initially, to avoid a new pathway for drainage, the cetons were developed, which were solid structures placed in the wound to form a drainage path. And these then gradually got designed into shunts and valves, which were tubular structures. The shunts provided a flow in either direction, whereas the valves allowed unidirectional flow. So from this, the concept of the GDD came, which were specially designed plates having connector tubes, which connect the aqueous either from the anterior chamber or the posterior chamber to a subtenon's lake, which we create at the equator. Coming to the GDD history, the first one was in fact the drainage system was that was used was a horsehair. Two corneal paracentesis, minute wounds were created, and a horsehair was threaded to allow for the aqueous drainage. And this was then modified and worked on to convert it into a polythene silicone tube use. But the first formal GDD was designed in 1973 by Molteno, and this was then further designed to make a valvular formulation, which was designed by Krupin. Molteno then worked on his own implant to make a double plant implant. But the major breakthrough in this entire segment occurred in 1992 and 1993 with the design of the Barwell valves and the AGV valves, that is designed by Ahmed and popularly known as the AGV. And of course, now we have the Indian versions for both of these. Among the different types of tubes that are available, we can categorize them into non-valved, that is, they do not have any valvular mechanism to control the pressure or the intraocular flow, intraocular pressure or the flow. And the most popular are the Barwell and the ADI. ADI, that is the Orolab aqueous drainage implant. And among the valve, the most popular, as I said, is the Ahmed. And also we have the Indian version, which is the KK Mehta valve. There are also implants for the non-penetrating drainage surgery, which are the absorbable and the non-absorbable, but they are very much into the research stage and still not taken up into the market and into practice. So I'll be discussing on the most frequently used ones, that is the AGV and the ADI. So what are the parts of a drainage implant? All of them have a connecting tube which connects from the aqueous, whether in the anterior chamber or in the posterior chamber, to the plate. This is the reservoir plate, which is the main function and the main system which controls the drainage of the aqueous. You have different holes and fenestrations in these plate. Some of these are the anchoring holes through which you pass your suture through the plate onto the episclera and sclera, whereas the others are for the fibrous tissue to grow in. So this fibrous tissue allows both the anchoring of the plate, it allows the formulation of the bleb encapsulation, and it also keeps the plate and the entire drainage device stable and prevent any ocular motility issues. The edge of the external plate has a ridge through which the tube inserts. So this ridge prevents any posterior occlusion and compression of the tube. And the valvular devices, they have a membrane valve, which is a highly sensitive structure. While handling, you should not be touching this area, which are present at the junction of the tube and the plate. And this valve opens only when the IOP goes beyond 8 to 10 millimeters of mercury. So how do these GDDs function? Basically, the construction of the plate is from such a material. Usually nowadays, they are elastomeric silicons to which fibroblasts cannot adhere. So what happens? When you implant your GDD into the episcleral space near the equator, with the tube lying either in the AC or the pars plana, there is formation of a collagenous capsule around the plate. So this subsequently gets surrounded by granulomatous reaction. Finally, the reaction resolves in 4 months and the capsule becomes stable. And finally, there is maturation over time. The capsule gets a little thinner and stabilization of the entire process occurs usually by 6 months. Now, as I said, because of the material, the fibrous capsule that is formed, it does not get adherent to the plate, but it just overlies the plate. So there is an aqueous pool which is created in this potential space between the plate and the surrounding capsule. And the aqueous collects here, passes through the capsule by diffusion, and then gets absorbed by the capillaries and the lymphatics, leading to the reduction of the intraocular pressure. So you can now understand that this fibrous capsule is the major tissue or the major substance which offers the resistance to the aqueous flow. So how much your device will function, how much will the IOP lowering happen, that is designed by this capsule. Here the bleb is, as we just heard in the prior keynote address, and Dr. Pandav also mentioned, the bleb here is placed away from the anterior limbus. Whereas in the conventional trab, it is more encroaching on the limbus and even sometimes on the cornea. So this reduces the inflammation. There is less amount of bleb thinning and lesser bleb dysesthesia. Whatever drainage device you use, there could be 2 types of major phases in the intraocular pressure that we see. One is, it could be the hypotensive phase, which is more common with the AGV in the initial parts. And again, depending on how you ligate your non-valved tubes and how and when do they get dissolved, it all depends on this phase. So here the bleb would be diffuse, it would be thick walled, and there will be minimal vascularization. There is also a hypertensive phase seen where the bleb would be inflamed and it would be dome-shaped. Again, this is more commonly seen with the AGVs subsequently, because in the AGVs, what happens, the aqueous starts flowing immediately. The moment you implant the bleb and close everything, the aqueous starts percolating. And so there is a lot of release of mediators and the entire process of capsulation begins right on. And so this process continues for a long time and there is a significant amount of inflammation and encapsulation. So the hypertensive phase occurs subsequently in an AGV. And this leads to an increased IOP. But whatever the drainage device used and whatever the initial phase is seen, ultimately, as I said, at the end of 6 to 7 months, there is a stable phase with the stabilization of the intraocular pressure. This stabilization may not necessarily be a low IOP or your target IOP, but ultimately it settles down. So the long-term IOP control finally depends on, of course, the surface of the implant. That is obviously the larger your implant, the more the amount of bleb formation and the more would be the diffusion of aqueous. It is inversely proportional to the bleb diameter and the bleb thickness. As I said, it also depends on the time of the aqueous flow initiation and the response of the tissue to the plate, which would be variable from individual to individual. So this progressive fibrous encapsulation is the major factor which limits and decides the filtration life of all the current GDDs. Now, when do you use the GDD? Now we all know at this point of time that a primary indication is, of course, in all complicated and refractory glaucomas as a secondary procedure when your trab has failed. But nowadays, a lot of surgeons are also taking up as a primary procedure when you're almost sure that your trab with or without an antimetabolite is going to definitely fail. So these indications, we all know: failed trab, pediatric glaucomas, NVGs, uveitis, post-surgery, traumatic glaucoma, aniridia, and though uncommon, but still sometimes seen, epithelial downgrowth. Patients with severe dry eye disease who might not tolerate all those anterior blebs that we just saw and possibly are very prone candidates for bleb dysesthesia, in also those cases, you can consider a drainage device. When should you avoid? There are now no known absolute contraindications where you cannot do a GDD. But definitely in cases where there is severe scleral or sclerolimbal thinning in collagen vascular diseases, ophthalmic eyes, high myopic eyes, or where the conjunctiva is extremely fibrous and friable, where dissection is going to be very difficult, there are risks of scleral perforation, then perhaps you might consider other alternatives and avoid a GDD. And finally, where should you implant the GDD? Now, most commonly used is a single plate implant. So it is implanted in the single quadrant. And the most common quadrant is the superior-temporal quadrant, which provides the easiest access to implant and is least likely to produce motility disturbances. Supranasal provides less space. There are more risks of motility disturbances. And because of the proximity of the optic nerve, there is risk of the optic nerve impingement. If there is presence of an inverse hypopyon, you should always place it in the inferior quadrant. Again, here infranasal is more technically difficult. Infratemporal is easy and there is more space. But in all these cases, to remember in the inferior part that because of the cosmetic concern, you may avoid a scleral graft, but rather use a corneal graft for the cosmesis and better outlook. Most of the cases, again, we usually use an implant and the tube going into the anterior chamber, but sometimes we may use a pars plana insertion also in eyes that have undergone vitrectomy when there is hardly any space in the anterior chamber, as in case of multiple peripheral anterior synechiae, in presence of compromised corneal endothelium, or in post-keratoplastic cases. So to conclude, before deciding your surgery, you have to consider the device design. You also need to remember that the RT is horizontally more in diameter, while the AGVs, they are more in the anterior-posterior diameter. Consider the patient need and the need of IOP control, their overall profile, the economic status, because each foreign valve and Indian valve, it costs different, and your own experience and condition. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Purvi. I think Dr. Purvi has actually covered a lot of ground for subsequent talks, and she has given you a very nice idea about the entire game plan about these devices. So I think we might run short of time, so I will straight go to the next talk. And the next talk is by Dr. Faisal, how to choose glaucoma drainage implant. Now, basically, we have only 2 prototypes available in India, so not much of a choice, but how relatively you will decide to choose is Dr. Faisal. Please go ahead with your presentation.
So at the outset, I thank Professor Pandav and the IOSC for giving an opportunity. And I'll be speaking out how to choose a glaucoma drainage implant. and we don't have any financial interest to disclose. So as talked by previous speaker, recently the glaucoma drainage implant have been increasingly doing for various types of glaucoma, and there is a significant shift in the practice towards the implant in eyes had previous history of any ocular surgery like failed trabeculectomy or any kind of intraocular surgeries. Basically, both these non-valve and valve would have some similarities in terms of tube design and plate, but there are a lot of difference also, like different in the size and material of the end plate, presence or absence of any unidirectional valve system. As Madam already told, the AGV has a unidirectional Venturi valve system which prevent the post-operative hypotony and its related complications. But it's also associated with a bleb encapsulation, hypertensive phases, and inadequate IOP control in sometimes. Whereas in Baerwald and Adi, that's a non-valve, the surgeon has to create a temporary ligature during the surgery, and the IOP has to be continued to be high at least for 4 to 6 weeks post-operatively, and always there is a risk of hypotony. So till the earlier part of this injury, we didn't have much data, but now we have enough evidence about its efficacy and safety. These two large randomized trials, that is AVB and ABC, which agree that both implants were effective in reducing the IOP need for glaucoma medications. But the slightly better results were observed in Baerwald group, that is non-valve group, in terms of IOP reduction and number of anti-glaucoma medication. The similar results were found in our own real data also. So now we have two implants in your hands, almost equal effect, with almost equal efficacy. So which one has to be preferred? So for that, you need to know some points before choosing your implant. So the most important part is parameter is the pre-surgery IOP. If the IOP is very high, even with the maximum number of medication, irrespective of your diagnosis, one should prefer a valved implant. In other scenario, if the IOP is not so high, it may be in high teens or late 20s with even number of maximum medication, one can prefer a non-valve device. Whereas if even the pressure is controlled with maximum number of medication and the patient could not tolerate the systemic medications, so one should better to go ahead with a valve devices. So as I already mentioned, they always have a risk of hypotony, and we know some of the eyes are more prone for hypotony post-operatively. So to get that, one should know the diagnosis properly. Eyes with inflammation or uveitic glaucoma, one should do a non-valve device very cautiously. Even sometimes patient can present with hypotony in years after surgery. So one should prefer a valve device. Other cases, vitrectomies also have a high tendency for hypotony. So one should prefer a valve devices. Our own data experience that AGV had a good outcome in this subset of eyes. So other conditions like the eyes having pre-existing scleral buckle or scleral tear, it is very difficult to dissect, very difficult to insert a large implant like non-valve devices, and high chance of post-operative tube exposure. In these eyes, one should prefer valve devices. Other conditions like aphakia also high risk for hypotony, and one should use non-valve device very cautiously. But in case of post-PK, if the eye is pseudophakic or phakic, one can go ahead with a non-valve device. But most of the studies said that long-term hypotony can lead to a graft failure. So one should use cautiously the non-valve devices. So other patient factors like deep set eye, short eyes, or prominent nasal bridge, in this type of patients, it's very difficult to put a large non-valve devices. One may go with a small valve device like AGV. So other fact, of course, your surgeon's experience and comfort, you should prefer the implant which is more comfortable in your hands. The last note, the least, the cost factor, especially in Indian scenario, we have the ADI which costs around 4,000 to 6,000, whereas the AGV which costs now more than 20,000. So the cost is a major barrier for opting a valve device in our setup. So in nutshell, so what are the factors to be thought before choosing your implant choice? So first, the underlying etiology, pre-surgery IOP and severity of glaucoma, tolerance to systemic medication, surgeon's comfort and experience, and cost and affordability. So to conclude, as mentioned in various studies, to conclude, the individual patient characteristics, surgeon's comfort, experience with each implant are critical in device selection. The benefit of each implant, reducing the IOP, must be balanced with the surgical complication associated with. Having said that, even the worst scenario, surgeon may forced to opt a non-valve device in Indian scenario because of most of our patients are belong to low socioeconomic background. Thank you, sir, for giving an opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Faisal, finishing right in time and saving us a minute. I think we'll take the questions in the end. I'll go with my presentation, and please note down the questions and we'll address them towards the end. So I'll be basically sharing my views on GDD implantation in different situations. So I'm not showing you the normal implant surgery, but I think the steps will be, kind of a demonstrated there. So we already know the complex situations. I think that Urvi has already mentioned where we need to put the implant. So I'm not going in details of these. So I'll go straight with the situation. Now, this is a 50 years old lady, and she had 6/9 vision, but the IOP is 40 millimeters of mercury with everything. On systemic carbonic anhydrase inhibitors. So and there's a staphyloma there. You can see the patient had a scleritis. So there's no way you can do a trabeculectomy there. Now, important thing is here is that behind this staphyloma, there's a normal sclera, and one can possibly put an implant there. So in the superior temporal quadrant, you can see there's a healthy sclera behind the staphyloma, about 8, 9, 10 millimeters from the limbus. So you find the sclera. I usually prefer to put a pre-placed sutures, and after priming the AGV implant, this is the AGV implant. So after priming the implant, you just suture the implant to the sclera there, like you do, in any other situation. I like to use the Dacron suture or Ethibond suture, which is 5-0 or 6-0. The reason is the needle is good. This is a side cutting, the spatulated needle, which has a less risk of scleral perforation. So I like to use that suture. Now again, here you have to go very carefully because this tissue can cheese wire very easily. So make a long track. I try to curve it a little bit to get it a little longer, a little more resistant tunnel. And here you have to go in one go. Frequent to and fro movement of needle will create multiple tracks and will be hard. And this definitely needed to be patched up with a preserved sclera from the eye bank. And once this is done, the pressure was well controlled in this patient without any medication for the next 1 year. After that, she did need some anti-glaucoma. The important thing is the underlying pathology has to be considered because the uveitis can come back again. And so in the perioperative period, they have to be monitored for the underlying pathology. And for that, you might have to talk to the person who, to the uveitis person. This is another patient who had his high myopia, had a retinal detachment, 26 years old, a young male, and had a silicone oil which was removed. So how do we do here? Because here you have a buckle is there. There's a band actually, so it's not a the pad buckle is a silicone band, and sometimes it's very hard to dissect this area. But here you could expose one of the quadrants, and here I'm passing the sutures, and I'm actually going through the band itself because it's lying somewhere there. And there was enough tissue was mobilized enough where we could put an implant. But again, the cost consideration is an issue. Otherwise, I might have opted for a AGV because that would have been much easier. But you have to also look at the patient affordability. And so if there's a band, you can go behind the band so that this implant is actually going behind the band and suture to the band more or less and to the underlying tissue. Because this is a non-valve device, so it has to be, this tube has to be ligated. That has to be kept in mind. And again, with a long needle tunnel, you could put the tube into the anterior chamber. And that's how I was dealt with. This is another 40 years old male patient. This I did long time ago when Adi was not available. And I specially procured a Barwell implant for this. This is Barwell 250. He had a very high buckle, but we didn't have any option at that time. Again, very poor patient, couldn't afford AGV. So I had no option but to do that extensive dissection. And the tissue was very scarred already. So I had to go all the way behind the, the buckle. There's a bit of risk of going on right to the optic nerve, but I think we were okay here. So because to avoid a, I actually cut the buckle and threaded the tube under that because I didn't want a lot of bulge in that area because of the overlying tissue was not very healthy. In this case, I put sutured, occluded the tube using a stent suture. The idea is that because this patient had high pressures, and if the pressure really goes out of control following this surgery or in the, while the suture lysis happens, one can always pull out this stent suture and release the pressure prematurely, though there is a risk of inducing a hypertonia at that stage, but sometimes you might have to do that. So here, because the anterior segment is very distorted, so the tube was put posteriorly, and again, like put a skilled patch graft, and then you covered the conjunctiva on top of it. This is how this patient looks like. So 10 years later, you can see the anterior segment is still, the cornea is still clear. Everything is, damaged. Iris is, tissue is all damaged and stuck to the back of the cornea, but you can see the tube behind the cornea, and that area where the tube is put, the tube is slightly visible, but the tissue is holding on very well. And the patient has a 360 vision with 18 to 20 millimeters of pressure with 2 anti-glaucoma drugs 10 years later. He's still, that's the only eye this patient actually, when he had a motor vehicle accident, the other eye was lost at that time. So this patient has been mobile, independent for 10 years after this procedure. So question is how well GDDs do in glaucoma following pars plana vitrectomy. And this is our own experience. 78 as a 78 patient where we did with GDD, where AGV was put, and they had trauma, regiment detachment, and other issues where vitrectomy was required, and on an average follow-up of 70 months. So we could see the pressure was well controlled in majority of these eyes. And the cumulative probability of success was like 92% at 2 years and 80% at 5 years. So that's actually very, very gratifying results with these tubes. So sometime when nothing works, I think these patients, of course, this is a qualified success. That means many of them would be on multiple drugs. So that is also there. And so you can see that there's significant reduction in the IOP as well, anti-glaucoma medicine in this group. But eventually after 2 years or 3 years, most of them, there's an increase in the number of anti-glaucoma medicine which is required to control the pressures in our 2 years, beyond 2 years. But still is a very good result giving the, looking at the situation that we are. The other thing is sometime if there's a very big implant, the other procedure you can do is you can put a shocker-like implant. So this is not a shocker implant, but some on similar concept basically. So what you do is you just open the conjunctiva carefully with this. You can see there's a lot of scarring. There's a big buccal there, and there's a very good capsule around the buccal. So when you dissect carefully as not to destroy the buccal. And this is a silicone tube with the size of the normal 0.6 millimeter outer diameter and about 3 millimeter internal diameter, and 0.3 millimeter. And you can see we can just with a needle create an opening there and put some viscoelastic into that space to expand it, and just thread that needle which we have made, and just push it as much as you can, and anchor this needle, this silicone tube to the sclera. So it becomes a socket-like implant basically. You're using the existing buccal and the capsule around that buccal for your advantage, and just put this tube into the anterior chamber like you do for any implant. Now in this case, I use Vicryl actually to fix the tube, but now I use non-absorbable suture because Vicryl can get absorbed and there could be late displacement of the tube. So this is the same patient who looks, you can see the tube is very well placed. This is after 3 weeks surgery. The other thing is the difference which is the post-penetrating cataplastic glaucoma, and these patients also, they tend to do poorly after routine surgery. So in this case, again, the surgery is like any other implant. So go expose one of the quadrants, and you can prime the valve. Here you could put a tube, or you could put a AGV, or you could put an RD implant like valve or non-valve. It's your choice. I think both will do equally well. So whatever, so you have to look at the preoperative IOP and how desperate you are to get the IOP control, how quickly you want the IOP control, and that could decide which implant you want. So procedure is basically similar to what we did earlier. So, and again, we had a series of these post-penetrating keratoplasty eyes, which we have published some time ago. And here again, we have used ADI as well as AG implant in post-penetrating keratoplasty eyes, and results is more or less similar. So it doesn't, as far as IOP control is concerned, there's no difference between the AGB valved or non-valved device in our series. And as you can see, the IOP control is almost similar over a period of time, but this is a short-term follow-up only. So I think what happens later, we don't know. So thank you very much. I think these were the basically, some of the cases that I want to show you in some of the situations where we might have difficulty in putting an implant, but they do very well, with this kind of implants. Any other surgery would have been impossible in these situations. Thank you so much. And I'll stop sharing my presentations and we'll go to the next talk. And next talk is by Dr. Harsh. Dr. Harsh is senior consultant at Center for Sight in New Delhi. He was associate professor at All India Institute of Medical Sciences before he went into practice. He's a very well-known glaucoma surgeon and excellent surgeon. I would have a lot of experience with laser and glaucoma surgery. And he has been president of the Glaucoma Society of India, has been involved in glaucoma education for a long time, and he has been awarded Padma Shri by the Government of India for in recognition of his services to the in his field. So, Dr. Harsh, it's a pleasure to have you with us this afternoon, and please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Panda, for the kind words. If you have been in as long as I have been in practice, you'll have all kind of complications. And obviously, if you're not lucky enough to have the excellent hand that Dr. Pandav has, then the chances are likely to increase. So anyway, we'll just go over them and then I'll just show you some slides. Obviously, one of the problems that can occur very nicely, everybody has covered the basics. So we can have a flat anterior chamber, tube migration, exposure, tube retraction, tube obstruction. So here the chamber is gone completely shallow, you can see, and it's actually a nightmare so many times. So it may be easy to do a valve, as Dr. Pandav has so nicely shown, but sometimes the complications are a nightmare indeed. And most of these cases are anyway very difficult primarily. So it is a tough job anyway. And you can have an exposed tube. And the biggest problem with the exposed tube is that the people in this, a lot of people in the periphery don't have a clue to what a glaucoma valve surgery is. So they'll see in the cornea, they'll see the tube is perfectly placed. They'll just not go out and see that the tube is exposed. And by the time they realize, or by the time they send the patient, it is already infected. So it is so common to find that kind of a problem. And obviously the tube can be blocked, the iris can just cover over it, and or you can have again the same thing, shallow chamber causing a completely this thing. There could be a hypotony. Obviously, when you have a flat anterior chamber, you have an associated hypotony. You can have a serious hemorrhage as well. And most of these cases we do observe only, and if you give atropine, steroids, and if you give, sometimes we have to give systemic steroids as well, and they do tend to settle down. But obviously, if you have a long-standing flat anterior chamber with kissing choroidals, and the vision is really gone down, then we may have to intervene, and we do have to intervene at times. And you can have massive choroidals which may require intervention. Again, suprachoroidal hemorrhage is a nightmare. You can have encapsulation and corneal graft failure. So you can have big cyst and bleb formations like that. And in the pediatric cases specifically, you can have almost 3 to 5% of the cases getting into squints. There could be corneal decompensation and obviously the dreaded endophthalmitis and scleral perforation. So there can be a tube corneal touch, which is not uncommon at all, as you can see over here. And end-off is something that we never want to see, but you still have to face it. So you you always do your valve nicely, but the next day you wake up and you find that the chamber is completely shallow, and it's extremely shallow. The tube is touching the cornea, so you have to reopen it, and then we have to pass a suture like they were showing in the Adi valve. So you have to basically pass a 6-0 vicryl to close up the tube over here so that there's no drainage through this. And be very careful. The first time I did this, I was so intense on that I cut the tube into two. So be careful, gently close it, and then you use a side port or a MBR blade, whatever you have to get into the anterior chamber. If it is very, very tricky, you can use a 30 gauge needle. Just get to pump in some fluid over there to see that to reform the chamber. Once the chamber reforms, you'll get an idea that whether it is there any other leak over there? Have you increased the size of the opening by the 23 gauge? Or was it just the valve which is malplaying? And once we see this and we realize that yes, the chamber is well formed now, you realize that possibly that was the cause which you have taken care of. Again, sometimes what happens is that you find that there's a hemorrhage over there. Somebody sent this case to us. The tube is a little on the longer side. Luckily, it's a fully vitrectomized eye. So you open it up again and so you open up the valve, you open up the areas and use a side port, put in a AC maintainer and go in and clean up the hemorrhage over there. Open up, take out the tube, shorten up the tube, go into the posterior chamber because already it's a good vitrectomized eye as the surgeon had informed us. And then instead of the anterior chamber, we go into the posterior chamber and place the tube over there, which is nicely seen. Always place the tube to an extent that it can be easily visualized in the pupillary area. So that is very, very important. And obviously you have to be sure that the vitrectomy is complete. Again, you have done a good job. Everything is in place. 6-6 vision pressures are controlled, and then the chap gets injured, the lens gets subluxated, the pressures get elevated, and then you realize that what has happened is that some of the vitreous has come on from the tilted IOL and gone anteriorly and blocked the tube. So you will have to make a 2-port vitrectomy over there, 2 or 3 port, and then what you do is that you know that there's a vitreous in the tube, so you inject tricord, and when you inject tricord, you realize that yes, there the vitreous is filling the tube. So then you go in with your cutter and actually just use the suction over there. You already have done a vitrectomy from the posterior areas so that all this area is clear. And then you just pull out this plug of vitreous which is present over there. So this has to be done. Suppose it is just a little bit of this thing, so sorry. If suppose it's just a little bit of it, then you can do it by just the laser. But if it is a lot of it, then you have to do a vitrectomy, and then we go in from the other side and actually push in a 30 gauge needle and see whether it is open and everything is good. And once we are sure that yes, the fluid is flowing through, then you are happy and you can see that no vitreous in the AC or in the posterior areas, and then you can close it up. Again, we are doing a lot of posterior valves, and in a diabetic, sometimes our retina surgeon said that it's not possible to do a full vitrectomy, but the result was evident. For 1 week, everything was fine, and then suddenly we realized that the entire vitreous, whatever vitreous was left by him, the PVD occurred and the entire thing came forward and blocked the tube. And again, you can see how a plug has formed of vitreous into the tube, which has again to be sucked out of that area, and the entire vitreous now has to be removed. So we have learned our lessons. So whatever time it takes, you have to induce a PVD, good a base dissection, as extensive in vitrectomy as you can do. Otherwise, you'll have to go in as we have to do in a few of the times. And we have published our this thing in Pan American Journal of Ophthalmology, where basically the pars plana between tubes we have described in detail. Another interesting thing that happened to us was that while placing a valve in this, we realized that it was too close to the cornea, and then suddenly I realized that I had the cut tube in my hand. So what we did was that we just placed this cut part under the thing to angle it away from the cornea. And then we just sutured this up over here, and that was not described before because, like I said, unless your hand is funny, you cannot get all the complications that sometimes we get. But this really worked wonders for us. And Dr. Vinay Gupta from AIIMS also did with me a couple of these cases, and they did well. We were a little worried whether the flow would be normal, but the flow was normal. And a lot of these cases have been done 5, 7, 8 years back and are doing well for us. And we published this in a new approach as ophthalmology at point of care. Again, many a times, as I think people have shown before also, there could be very well, things could be working well for a long time, and then suddenly there is a huge cyst formation, the pressure starts going up. What do we do? In a child, do we do a repeat AGV or do we do a DLCP? Or what you can do is you can just open up the cyst over there. So obviously you have to have first AC maintainer, you have to apply inferiorly, and then you have a look at the cyst, open up the cyst, and you realize that the huge cyst is formed that I think we have also shown very nicely. So you excise the cyst and you take out all the fibrous tissue, as extensive a excision as you can do. As you can see, the plate is perfectly normal, nothing has happened over there, but it is this thick scar tissue that is formed on top of it. And this fibrous capsule, we try and do as huge a dissection as we can, not trying to damage the plate by any chance, and then putting in the mitomycin C over there in order to prevent any further fibrosis. As you can see, it's a huge cyst over there. And then once that part is done, wash it up and close it up, and the child as well. Sometimes the tube does get exposed, as we said, and then we have to, unfortunately, many of these cases, the conjunctiva is very, very friable, and it is practically impossible to pull the conjunctiva over to try and do this. And if you just try and place a conjunctival flap over there, it will not succeed. So you have to actually cut out a scleral flap of the size, push it underneath. You can either suture it up or you can place a glue over there to really make it stable over there. Once that part is covered, then you can try and use a cut out the conjunctiva from one of the sides. And once you have enough conjunctiva, obviously whenever you are taking out whatever the size, you must have at least 1/3 larger piece over there for allowing it to retract. And once that part is covered, then one can just suture it up over there. But these are messy cases, definitely, because initially we obviously try and undermine and get the thing to oppose by itself. It is very, very important in these situations to usually give doxycycline, which I learned from Sirisha's paper, Sirisha and Lakshmi's paper, and really works wonders. That the healing is very, very good by giving doxycycline for some time. And once you suture this up, I think that part is over. However, sometimes the eye is bad. It's only PLPR inaccurate. A lot of hypotony, tube is exposed, and there's a leaking area all around it. All you want to do is to preserve the structure and prevent endophthalmitis. So in these situations, all you want to do is to just take out the tube and close up the area firmly in order to not allow. So whenever we are taking out the tube, we basically have to, we need not take out the plate because that will be a very messy thing. You just pull it over to allow the other cut end to retract, and then just to maintain the thing, we pushed in some air from anteriorly and posteriorly, and that is how the eye became stable.
Sir, your video or slides are not moving.
Now is it moving?
No, not yet. It's only on the tube exposure repair slide.
Okay, I think we are pretty much done on that. I
Otherwise,
think
you can share it again.
the previous slides were moving.
Yes, sir. It got stuck on the cube exposure slide.
That's all right. That was the last one. So I think thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Harsh, for taking us through the, the range of complications and how we manage them. I think I'll do with the last talk. There's a wound healing perspective and its implication on the patient post-operative care. I'll do that, and then we'll be open for discussion. Let me find my slide first. Okay. Sharing.
So are you facing any problem? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I
Okay.
got it
Okay.
now. Yeah, I had a little issue, but I think that's okay now. All right, so we'll talk a little bit of the wound healing and this is basically common to most glaucoma surgeries because we are creating a fistula which is not natural to the body. So body always try to close it, but to have better outcomes, we need a careful selection of the patients, a good careful dissection, minimize tissue trauma, and also a good post-operative cares goes without saying. But still, things are not always in our hands. And understanding the cause of failure, the fibrosis, and that could help us understand. I think Dr. Purvi already alluded to this, that we are basically draining fluid from the aqueous from the anterior chamber under the subtenons space around the plate, and you get a thick fibrous capsule around that. And
Sir,
those
your previous presentation is visible, not the current one.
Yeah, this is the previous presentation.
No, this is. Let me see. The wound healing is, but I am seeing the.
You could perhaps close down the previous one and
Something
Yeah.
had happened after I stopped.
Maybe it's still
Something
open.
was happening there also.
Yeah, okay, sir.
Admin can help. Something is wrong there.
Sure, sir. Just close your previous presentation and
It's closed.
yeah.
What do I do now?
Then open your PowerPoint first, sir.
It's open.
Okay. Then click on share screen.
Okay, I'll share again. Okay.
Okay. Now you can see in a window box.
Yeah, I can see.
Yeah. Just click on that, sir. Yeah.
All right. So,
yes, sir.
so this is visible now.
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. So it was visible to me, but probably not to you. All right. So I'm so sorry about that. So basically, we are talking about the wound healing, and so we understanding wound healing is important. And we are basically creating a bleb which is away from the limbal area, but still it is a bleb, and it goes through all those dynamics how a bleb is formed. The important thing is that the efficacy of the procedure depends on how much fluid can get through this fibrous capsule. And we know that GDDs have a success rate of say 70% to 80%, but it tends to go down with time and could go down as low as 40 to 50% over a period of time. And histological studies just suggest that there's a lot of thick fibrous capsule around these eyes, which is formed over a period of time. So Dr. Purvi has already alluded to this basically about the hypertensive phase. So I will not go into details, but there's a lot of inflammation. Basically there are three things happening. There's a surgical trauma. There's a device which will induce some kind of foreign body reaction, even if it is inert. And there's aqueous, presence of aqueous will also modulate, will also, transform the wound healing response, and basically have a lot of fibroblasts there, which proliferate and convert them into myofibroblasts. They lay down collagen, which forms a wound, capsule around it, and which could become later on, which could become a thick fibrous capsule. Now, the success of the GDD depends on the ability of the fluid to pass through the fibrous capsule. Now, clinically, there's no way actually to measure that how much is the porosity, how much fluid is getting through the implant. But experimentally, we can do that. And we actually did a few experiments to see what determines the porosity of the implants. So exposure of the implant to the aqueous itself is, there's a concept of good aqueous and bad aqueous. And sometimes the trials fail, we say, because the aqueous has cytokines in it and they induce fibrosis, and that's why it fails. So in our experimental setup also, we noticed something similar. So if you have a implant, we did an experimental implant and connected with anterior chamber. We did connect with the anterior chamber earlier, but after 4 weeks we connected it. And if you can see the histologically, the implant which were not implants which were not connected to the AC, they had a thin capsule and they were very porous. Whereas the implants that were connected to the anterior chamber, that is, the aqueous was flowing through it, the capsule was thick and their porosity had gone down. So aqueous definitely playing some role here. But interesting thing was that, and this the role of aqueous has been actually described long time ago. If you go to old literature, even the early 60s, so there was a lot of talk about this. But the interesting thing was that in one of the experiments, we replaced the aqueous with a non-aqueous fluid, that BSS, and strangely we got the same effect. So if you let the BSS pass through this capsule, they become thick and fibrous, and if you don't pass any fluid through them, they remain thin and they remain like porous, because this experiment was done at a short point of time, only 1 month long. So we didn't see any reaction on the capsule. So capsule didn't become thick, whereas the porosity went down. So the IOP went up, you can say, but without increasing the thickness of the capsule. So from this we kind of deduced that perhaps the thickening of the capsule that we see, thick capsule, is kind of not a primary phenomena, it is a secondary phenomena. And the primary phenomena is basically happening in the porosity of the capsule, which is getting reduced on exposure to aqueous or any other fluid like BSS. So based on this, we had our own kind of hypothesis that why the bleb would fail, and that would be true for any glaucoma surgery basically. So surgical trauma, foreign body, it induces some inflammatory reaction, and foreign body reaction. And this reaction actually subsides with time, with the passage of time, and would stabilize. So you will get a capsule, a fairly mature capsule in 4 to 6 weeks time. But in 4 weeks to 6 weeks time, even after that, if you start, if you expose the fluid, if the fluid start going through it, something goes wrong. Something gets reactivated actually within the capsular area. So you get probably the hydrostatic pressure or just the presence of the fluid will reactivate those cytokines, those cells which are the fibroblasts basically, which are there, and they'll start proliferating, and they'll also start producing more cytokines, more growth factors and collagen and other extracellular components they will lay. And they'll also convert into myofibroblasts and they'll proliferate. So this will reduce the porosity of the capsule. And once the porosity of the capsule is reduced, the IOP goes up. And then when the IOP goes up, it again, the hydrostatic pressure actually goes up further. So this is a vicious cycle. So the more IOP goes up, the more the proliferation happens, and the more thickening and porosity of that goes down, and the more thickening happens. And this probably happens. This is not a implant bleb. This is a trabeculectomy bleb actually, which probably has gone through a similar phase, and you have very thick cyst which is formed at the site of trabeculectomy. And something similar can happen over the implant also. So from here, basically, we understand is that there may be, how we can avoid the, how we can use this information to get better blebs in clinical practice. So important thing is the control the inflammation, obviously, that we all do, minimize tissue trauma, and we are using the topical steroids, to control inflammation. Also having more porous thin capsules. We need more porous and thin capsules. So maybe we can design the materials which have less foreign body reaction, or modify the surface of blunt. And all these things have been tried and still are being tried. And you can have some drug-eluting GDD where you have some mitomycin C-like drug which inhibits fibrosis around it. Or you can also use mitomycin C and other adjuvants at the time of surgery. But in case of implants, this has not really shown to be effective. There's no evidence to say that MMC really helped. What another thing comes out of these experiments and is that if you keep the IOP low in the early postoperative period, it will reduce mechanical stress on the capsule, and it will also prevent or interrupt the vicious cycle that I referred to. So the post-operative anti-glaucoma medicine can be considered, after any glaucoma surgery, especially when the IOP starts building up, especially after the implants. So if you have a non-valve devices, the tube is ligated. So in non-valve devices, the tube is ligated. So invariably, when the tube gives way, the IOP control is very good in those devices, especially in the early phase. But subsequently, when the tissue is exposed to the aqueous, the fibrous tissue again gets activated, and the capsule becomes thicker. So important thing is to monitor IOP in the post-operative period and use anti-glaucoma drugs, to keep the IOP on the lower side. Now, there is some evidence in clinically also, because this studies, quoting here, suggests that there is significantly greater IOP reduction if treated with timolol dorzolamide prophylactically in the post-operative period as compared to controls. Now, I think this many people now actually have started following up this, this kind of paradigm, that in the post-operative period, you keep you treat, especially in AGV, where we know there's a hypertensive phase. So before the hypertensive phase develops, one can prophylactically start treating these people, these eyes with the anti-glaucoma drugs to keep the IOP low. And people have reported better results, after that strategy. So to summarize, glaucoma drainage device failure is related to wound healing, and efforts should be made to minimize inflammation, minimize tissue injury, but also probably reducing the fluid flow through the tissue can help. So for that reason, if you're giving prophylactic aqueous suppressants, that might be useful. And of course, if there's any complication, that has to be managed promptly to have better results. Again, thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much. And now this is open for
thank you, Dr. Pandav. I think that was wonderfully done, the last part. I also learned a couple of things, so that was really nice. Can we talk to Dr. Saurabh for a second? Is he around?
Yes, I think Dr. Saurabh is here.
Hi.
Dr. Saurabh,
Hi,
I'm
Dr.
Dr.
Kumar.
Saurabh is-
Hi,
very
Dr. Saurabh, I just
glad
wanted
that you
to.
got with us, and
Just
very happy
wanted-
that you could spare your time for us this afternoon. And I'm sure we'll have some questions. So, Dr.
Yeah, I just wanted to inform Dr. Saurabh that I don't know, you so beautifully showed all the things about that bleb. This thing, we have two papers on which we actually did laser for the bleb. One is published in IJO in 2004, another in ophthalmic lasers, in which we had painted by gentian violet that area of the enlarged bleb, and then did the lasers with the same spot size as we do in gonioplasty, the larger spot size, to star it down. And then it really helped us a lot, and not in everybody, but at least 30% cases.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kumar. I'll go through that paper. Yeah, it sounds like a very interesting concept, something I've learned today. So thank you very much for that. Yeah.
My pleasure.
So I think these blebs, they do get dysfunction. I mean, how much ever care you take, there are many, ways to do, trabeculectomy. But in spite of that, we end up, sometime with this kind of blebs. So what is the fundamental? Is there something which is fundamentally there which we are missing? We haven't considered, or I mean.
I think, as you showed, Dr. Singh, that Dr. Pandav, that the healing, the wound healing, and it's different for everybody. So whatever we may do, some of these cases will still end up with ring of steel, and then focal thinning, and then leakages. But I think what I was trying to show is that there are things we can do from our side. Of course, not everybody will end up like a perfect bleb, and very few actually do. If you look at them over a period of time. But if we start at a right place where it's underneath the lid, have a larger area of application of MMC, not having a overriding conch, then we can reduce the chances. So I think that's all we can try for. But you're absolutely right that many of these blebs will end up, not being, functionally as well as both aesthetically and for dysesthesia as well. So they will end up like that. But I think we should still try what the principles are to try and reduce the incidence, particularly not having nasal blebs. So I think that's what is what I've understood in this time. Yeah.
You did talk
That
about
was very nicely shown by Dr. Saurabh, because I had exactly a same case like that and I didn't really make it out. And thank you so much for today showing how the eye rotates while we are actually.
Yeah, so this is something very, because we see this, like we think that we are operating at 12 o'clock and we want to do
Exactly.
that during the surgery,
Yeah.
but the eye is already rotated by, 3, 5, 10, 15, 20 degrees. So although we are trying to do our best, but it's unless we mark it beforehand, and that's why refractive surgeons do this beforehand, before the patient lies down, that you have to mark the eye. Otherwise, your surgery will be completely at the wrong place, be it a toric IOL implant, be it a refractive, laser surgery where you are doing astigmatic corrections. So they have to do it before the patient lies down. So I think that's the key thing to.
Very nice concept, Saurabh, given by you for all these glaucoma surgeons practicing in India today.
Thank
To
you very
mark
much.
the bleb area.
Yeah. It
Yeah.
takes a minute or so, but like once or twice it's happened that, one of my couple of my private cases, I'm running late and towards the end of the list, and I say, okay, fine, they just come into the theater straight away, and actually, you pay the price for saving that couple of minutes, and you end up, slight dysesthesia. But often, sometimes, like if you have a patient like that and you have to do a cataract eventually, then you can obviously revise the bleb at the same time so that they don't have to go to surgery again. And also, I've seen that, sometimes patients have very little bleb, even if they are draining down, and they can be dysesthetic, and other patients don't feel at all. So it's a patient, response to the foreign body thing as well, that how they behave. So it's not just about what we do; it's like the patient understanding and patient's reaction to the thing, which makes a big difference as well.
I think the other way to, if you have not marked, I think I kind of look for the superior rectus insertion. So you can actually identify where the superior rectus muscle is inserted, and that take as a guide for where the 12 o'clock position will be.
Exactly. Yeah, that's another interesting way. But sometimes the insertion is so big,
There's a
you don't
variation.
exactly.
also,
Yeah,
yes.
it's variation as well of the insertion.
The
Yes.
corneal tractions, which are mostly we are not identifying the superior.
That's right. We are not dissecting so far back as well. That's right.
And any three of you have used the anti-VEGFs post-operatively to reduce the fibrosis?
So we obviously, like everybody else does, fire a few injections, but I also find in some really bad young young males, especially uveitis, combining the fire a few with Avastin injection subconj seems to make a difference for those really difficult cases. And the other thing which as a glaucoma society, we should be passing on our message to the general surgeons and general doctors is that not to prime the conj by using drops which cause red eye. I think that is one of the reasons for, this is obviously anecdotal, for failure of trabeculectomy, that if you're using drops which are causing severe red eye, particularly carbonic anhydrase inhibitors or certain prostaglandins, then you are already leading to more healing and fibrosis. So we are now doing a study of about 400 patients where we are looking at the conjunctiva and what drops they have been using and taking tissue samples during trabeculectomy. So hopefully in a few years we will know if there are certain drops which cause this thing more. But the other thing, Dr. Pandey, you said about the MMC in tube. So this is again an interesting thing. This is again my feeling that MMC helps in tube surgery, especially like the Afro-Caribbean patients that we have. So we have done a study now, a pilot study of about 50 patients with trabeculectomy with my MMC, tube with MMC and no MMC. So we will see some results. This is just a very short 50 patients in each group and see whether there is a difference. But that is my impression. But yeah.
The literature is
Prior results, I
not
think,
very
are
clear on this
equivocal.
because there are some studies which say that there's a benefit and equal numbers say that there's no benefit. In fact,
Correct.
there was someone was making in a kind of a implant is a some kind of membrane kind of a thing which had mitomycin C and could be put over the implant. When you close it, so that will release that anti-fibrotic drug over a period of time to reduce the fibrosis. But I don't think I haven't heard about that for some time now.
That's correct. Yes. So the literature is not there. You're right, but I think we haven't actually addressed that question in the current glaucoma surgery very well, because some of these are previous studies where you have uveitic glaucomas, eurubeotic glaucomas, which are inherently more prone to, let's say, hypotony or failures in that sense. So I think we do need a good study. So that's why we've done this pilot study to see we can generate some numbers to then address in a bigger study. So that, what's your experience, Dr. Harsh, about MMC? Do you use it?
Actually, I asked a couple of people and then I read, because sometimes we were getting sad that we are requiring 4 drugs with them. So actually I asked Panda only, and he said that the results are equivocal. I went back and read. So whatever studies are there till now, I do not recommend per se, because half of them says it's okay, half of them says it's not worth it. So it becomes tricky that way.
Yeah.
I would rather go in with maybe Avastin. Avastin the fibrosis for some time.
The problem is it's a very short-acting drug. That is the
It is
difficulty. It's a very short-acting drug. Yeah.
Even though if you
Safer at least.
you have an Avastin injection into the vitreous cavity, I think in NVG, neovascular glaucoma, I think better outcome has been reported in that sense, but then probably you had to give it to the vitreous rather than at the site, because it will run off very quickly.
In all the high myopes, Pandam, I am using the this thing. If Avastin is now not available with the any anti-VEGF, because high myopes I can't use mitomycin. I am not comfortable with Hologen. So I'm using, and I have around 8 or 9 patients with -8 myopia, and they are all doing very well with pure Avastin.
Actually, I used to use Avastin.
This is subconj Avastin, or
at the end of
subconj?
Actually, I used to use Avastin sometime, a couple of years ago, actually, when it was easily available to us. It was available free of cost, actually. It was not adding to the cost of surgery. Free of cost in the sense they were retina guys were using Avastin, and
exactly. We get them
so we would use that. So I was injecting it into the anterior chamber at the end of the surgery. Right. So you do your surgery, close it up, and put in the anterior chamber, so that will pass through into the filtration area.
Right. That's fair enough.
Yeah. So I think I had some experience to say that okay, it works, but again, there's no big, kind of a control study to say that it really works or to recommend it. But I think some it happened that the splice stopped, the free supply stopped, so we stopped using it.
I also did a couple of cases of anti-VEGF into the anterior chamber at the end of the surgery, but then the results are not satisfying. So we thought it is just adding the cost. Mitomycin works better.
No, I think it's not.
You can't compare with
the point is, it's not comparative. If obviously mitomycin is cheaper, and we have developed the idea to put it for so much time to get good results. So that's why I'm not doing it as a routine, but in high myopes where you can't put mito, that is the place where I'm doing it. That's what I'm saying.
Dr. Faisal, one of the things which, in the indications about Ahmed valve, I find particularly here, because the cost is very similar for us, for both Ahmed and Barwell, I prefer to use Ahmed in a very elderly patient, like, 90-year-old or 85-year-old, because they are still living for another 5-10 years, and they don't need very low target pressures, and they don't need then further intervention, like, worrying about the ligating suture lysis or taking out the sutures, because I use mitomycin for all my Barwell tubes, so I have to ligate it with a nylon and also put a ripcord suture. So for that reason, this is just a very relative, thing about very elderly patients, because some of these actually still lose sight if you don't do, they're living longer and longer, especially in these countries where we are. People are living till 95, 100. So we have got to plan for, at least till 95, 100. So that's another relative indication that it's much simpler for them, that they don't have to come back too much. And the other thing which I wanted to mention is about testing the Ahmed valve. So we always test the Ahmed valve before the surgery. So, and we do find that some of them actually don't close even at very low pressures. So we reject those valves. And more recently, so I always keep in touch with Bilal from New America, and give them feedback. But I find that New World Medical, sorry, and I find that although they have made their processes stringent, sometimes still the valves do fail after implantation, that their pressure is very low afterwards.
That's a very nice point, because I learned it at my cost later. And then I started doing it the same thing, put one high pressure and put at low pressure, because we just used to put it at high pressure. And
Right.
I think that's a very nice point.
Are you measuring the pressure, like the opening pressure?
Yes. So what we do is we connect before implanting the valve, we prime it obviously, and then use a BSS bottle, and then see what height of the bottle the valve opens up. We're just cannulating the valve and measuring it, and just roughly getting an idea. Let's say it's 12 to 14 centimeter of water, or is it lower? Closing pressure, is it 0 or is it 6 or 7? If it is 6 or 7, 5, that's fine. But if it is 0, then obviously there is a chance that the valve is potentially defective, and then you put it in the eye and the pressure will be 0. It's like a non-valve thing. Or sometimes you implant the valve and you find that the AC is not being maintained because the valve is not working. So then obviously you put it Vicryl tie for 6 weeks or so and do a Sherwood slit just to buy some more time. So those are the nuances of Ahmed valve. And I had a patient, VIP patient from America who came, film personality, and I put in Ahmed valve, and it didn't, the pressure went 0, and he had kissing choroidals, and I had to go back and tie it up secondarily. So these are the problems we still face with valve implants as well, in spite of they're supposed to be not draining at low pressure.
Other time I find it a little difficult to have unpredictable result is uveitis patient or eyes which have been very high pressures chronically, where the ciliary body is actually not working, is kind of atrophic, and they
Correct.
have high pressure, but they go into hypotony very quickly if you drain a little bit. So again, there you have a little difficulty. So I think their valve device perhaps is a better option there, definitely, because these, especially the GIA patients, young patients who have uveitis.
GIA, absolutely. Yeah, no, for them, a non-valve is a very risky procedure. Absolutely, I agree. Yeah.
Dr. Harsh, you said that when the vitreous gets blocked, so how do you actually, sometimes when the tube, the vitreous blocks the tube, and with a cutter, so what I experienced once that I cut the vitreous and the vitreous wick remained in the tube.
Yeah, so that's what we did. We are not using the cutter there. We are using the suction mainly. So that's what I showed, that once you have put the tricot, it stains the whole thing, and once you suck it out, you can actually see the whole thing come, the vitreous bulb coming out from there. So both the cases that I showed had that so beautifully. Actually, that's what I wanted to show there. So instead of if you cut all around, but that side you just suck it out.
All right. Okay. So
and if it is very little, sometimes just doing a little yak can sometimes work as well. If it is very little, it's not just entering into it.
Yeah, it's hard to cut with the yak actually.
Yeah, just one. Okay, I think.
Sorry to interrupt you all. I think we are out of time. And thank you once again on behalf of AIS Scientific Committee, Dr. Pandav, Dr. Harsh, especially Dr. Saurabh Goel, for staying with us throughout the session. And thank you, Dr. Purvi, Dr. Faisal, for making this session a great success.